What's up everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to the vlog. We got a special one for you today. As you can see behind me, we have two different generations of Corvette and they are 11 years apart. We're about to jump into them and see if we can tell why they're 11 years apart. Let's jump right into it. All right guys, so as you can see behind me, we have a 2008 Chevrolet Corvette Z06. Now, I know by now you guys are already asking yourselves, well, wait a second, Justin. You got a 2008 there and a 2019 ZR1. How is there only one model year separating these? Well, there can be one model year. So basically, you could get the C6 Z06 up until 2013, and then you could get the C7 Stingray starting 2014. So technically, there is only one model year separating these two cars, and we're about to go over all of the differences between the C6 and the C7. Even though mine's a ZR1, we're gonna try to leave the ZR1 differences out just because it's not exactly apples to apples here. But if you guys are familiar with the channel, I did own a C7 Corvette Z06, so I know what is the same in the ZR1 and what is different. We're gonna touch on those as we go through all of this. But for now, this is the Z06. You guys have probably seen the previous videos by now of me talking about why you may want to consider this car and what makes it so special. But let's go ahead and jump over to the ZR1 so we can talk a little bit about the C7 platform as well. So like I said, guys, this is a 2019 ZR1. Now, we could have had up to a 2015 Z06. I had a 15 Z06, so I can talk to you all about the differences here. There's not a whole lot that changed from the C7 Z06 to the C7 ZR1, minus some aero and a little bit of a width on the front end. But for the most part, they're the same cars. So we're gonna compare these two and talk about the difference that 1 year makes. Obviously, right off the bat, the styling of the car is very similar. So you got the front engine, the longer hood, and of course your rear hatch, the cargo space. A lot of the stuff stayed the same from the C6 to the C7. But yet they're worlds apart whenever you really start drilling down into it. So we can't talk about the C6 Z06 without mentioning the engine. This is a LS7, which is a 7-liter V8, naturally aspirated, and it creates 505 horsepower. It is a dry sump oil system, which is very similar to the C7 Z06. The biggest thing that is different here is the fact that this is naturally aspirated, where the C7 is supercharged, and for the first time ever, you could get the C7 Z06 in an automatic instead of only manual transmission. The C7 also had a convertible option or came with a targa top, whereas the C6 and the C5 Z06 were fixed roof coupes. So as you guys can see here, this is the side profile shot of the C6 Z06. And of course, the side shots of these cars look very similar because of their general shape. Like I said, the long hoods in the front to house those big V8s with the hatchback style, real big cargo room interiors. This is obviously going to look very similar to the C7, which we're going to look at in 1 second. The big note here though is to look at the front A-pillars. They're basically identical. So obviously here is the C7 ZR1, very similar obviously to the shape of the C7 Z06, so just ignore the fact that it's the ZR1 in this case, but you can still see where Chevy got their inspiration from. The C6 Z06 has a very similar shape here. You got that long front hood still, the sloping rear hatch, and even just the general shape of the doors is very similar. And like I said, if you look at those A-pillars, they are shaped exactly the same. So the inspiration here was definitely more so improve upon something that's already really good versus totally take it back to the drawing board when it comes to the C6 versus the C7. Looking at the front of the C6 Z06, we notice this is the first generation that Chevy decided to not use flip-up style headlights, and we get the traditional Corvette style headlights on this one, which obviously carried over to the C7 after the fact, both of which do not have flip-up headlights anymore. And in my opinion, it was an awesome look. I appreciated the departure from the flip-ups, but if you look at the front bumper portion of the car here, you can see where all of the air gets taken in to cool down the big 7-liter V8. This again was the first generation that really opened up the bumper there to allow better cooling, versus the C5 was what they call a bottom feeder, basically pulled up all the air from underneath the front bumper instead of through the front bumper. That again carried over to the C7 as well, and ultimately even into the C8. All of the radiators are right up front. Nothing goes up under the front bumper anymore. And just for a quick reference, you can see here on the C7, it is the same style headlights, no more flip-ups. We got a little bit more of a daytime running light LED approach with this particular generation to bring it more up to date over the C6, but we also have the wide open front bumper there for cooling purposes. Even though this is the ZR1, the Z06 still had a more open front bumper, just not quite as open as the ZR1. So we could sit here and crawl over the differences between these two cars for the next 3 days. To be honest with you, it comes down to two pretty simple things. One, this is more up to date, and two, it's got better technology. Now those kind of can be the same thing depending on how you view them, but the biggest differences are the infotainment system on this car is going to be far better than this one. The technology in general is far better, and most of the lighting in the car is LED, whereas over here it's incandescent. So even though there can only be 1 year that separates these two generations, it really feels like a generation apart. We're going to drive both of these cars so you guys can get a little bit more of a feeling for why there is a generation between these two. So we're going to go ahead and go through some of the differences here between these two cars. We're going to touch on some of the bigger ones pretty quickly. First, we're going to start with the front and rear wheels being bigger. So they're 1 inch larger. 20s in the rear, 19s in the front versus the C6, 19s in the rear, 18s in the front. Also have larger front and rear rotors and brake calipers on the C7 than we do on the C6. Slight differences in styling to give it more of an updated approach. So the C7 has a little bit more of a Ferrari-esque look about it than the C6 does. That is, of course, up to you if you favor that or not. Personally, I do think the C7 looks better, but the C6 is not to be discounted, like I said. One of the bigger differences that you're going to notice right off the bat is especially the aero. So the aerodynamic differences between the two cars. The C7 Z06 gets a lot more aero, a bigger front splitter, the side skirts, and even a rear spoiler, whereas the C6 Z06 doesn't really get any of that stuff. You can add it from the C6 ZR1, which I probably will be doing, but at the end of the day, if you're buying these cars stock for stock, the C7 Z06 is going to have more aero and a better planted feeling when driving because of said aero. Like we talked about a second ago, the technology in the C7 is better. You got a better infotainment system, you got better traction control, you got better speedometer clusters with the digital screen in the center and all that good stuff. Whereas on the C6 Z06, it's a lot more analog gauges. And again, this is up to you if this is how you prefer it, because some people do prefer the more analog touch. But at the end of the day, personally, I favor the more technology of the C7. And that's especially apparent when backing out of my driveway, because there is no backup camera on the C6. Now, that does change, I believe, as the years go on. I do believe you did get a backup camera on the C6 Z06 at some point, but this particular one does not have one. It really makes you realize how dependent we've become on backup cameras. Now, we touched on a little bit the LED differences, and of course the taillights, the headlights. There's LEDs everywhere on the C7 Corvette, whereas on the C6, they're all incandescent bulbs, and that includes the taillights, the headlights, the interior lights. Pretty much everything on the C6 is incandescent minus the low beam headlights, which are HIDs. Like I said though, guys, where the cars are really going to be separated is in the driving experience. So let's jump in the C6 Z06, take it for a drive, and talk about our experience. Before we jump into the C6, I want to address something that's kind of odd, but this is one of the places that I noticed the biggest difference. And believe it or not, it's opening the door. I know that sounds weird, but just the approach to opening this and the way it clicks into position is much more flimsy or loose feeling than it is on the C7. It's going to be hard to capture that on camera, but the same or a very similar difference exists between the C7 and the C8. It seems like it gets sturdier as the generations go on, because my C5 was definitely floppier than this, believe it or not. But this is relatively, I guess floppy is probably a good word. It doesn't seem like it snaps into place as well as it should. Okay, so we're in the C6. We're going to go ahead and fire it up. Now, this is a 100% stock exhaust. Keep that in mind. Not bad, but not super loud. Of course, the C7 is going to be a little bit louder. So first thing we notice after being in the C6 here is, of course, that infotainment system that I was talking to you about. It's not horrible, it's just not super up to date. The gauges are all analog minus one little strip of digital text, but nothing like an LED screen or anything like that. The layout in general is not as quality as the Corvettes that come after the C6. Of course, we got the infamous cobalt steering wheel. A lot of use of plastic and not a whole lot of use of leather or aluminum like there is in the C7 and the C8. But at the end of the day, this is not me trying to talk you out of a C6. I just want you to understand the differences here. I still do believe that the C6 Z06 is one of the best bargain buys out there, especially because of the aftermarket that's available for this car. But there are definitely sacrifices that were made to make this car as lightweight as it is. So let's take it for a ride. We're going to talk about kind of the driving experience, the feel, and then we're going to jump in the C7 and see how it compares. So like I was saying, the C6 Z06 only comes in a manual transmission. So if you are looking for a Z06 in an automatic, the C7 would be your best bet, and actually your only bet as of right now, until the C8 Z06, which God knows when that's going to be available. But right off the bat, me being a person who has driven both of these cars can already feel this car has a lot more road feel. It's less muted than the C7 when it comes to actually feeling the road. The steering wheel is still a hydraulic system, whereas on the C7 it's electrically actuated, I guess, and you can feel it. So again, this car is not a slouch. 505 horsepower in a car that weighs about 3,100 pounds. It's not bad. And in fully stock form, the exhaust, the look, the power, everything you're seeing is 100% stock here. And it's not bad. We're on relatively smooth roads here in Pennsylvania, and it feels okay. You're able to feel the performance without it being super jarring, but this particular car is definitely a little more jarring than the C7 is, and you're especially going to notice it going around turns. The frame is not as stiff as the C7, and you can feel that. Now, Chevy tried to stiffen up the frame in this car, or stiffen up the experience, by making the roof not removable. The C6 base had a removable roof. The Z06 does not, because they wanted to stiffen this thing up as much as they possibly could. And if you guys remember in the beginning of the video, I was talking about the C7 having a targa top or a convertible option, because the frame was already so stiff, it didn't matter if the roof came off or not. So that 1 year or that generation divide makes a big difference when it comes to the stiffness of the frames in these cars. But the overall driving experience of this is not bad. It is not a bad car, and at no point while driving this do I feel like I'm in an 11-year-old car. It feels a little bit older. I would say probably more like a 2015 experience here, because I can definitely tell the driving experience is a little bit dated, but not 11 years worth. So again, I know it's probably gonna be kind of hard to hear the exhaust in this car because it is fully stock. It's not the loudest thing on the planet, but back in this particular car's day, people were still figuring this stuff out. The EPA was not as loose as they became later on with allowing these exhausts to be a little bit more opened up. So even though it does sound pretty good in person, it's not as loud as some of the other cars that we have obviously driven. Now, another thing I can notice while driving the car, even though this one only has 12,000 miles on it, I can hear a lot of random creaks and pops and things of the plastic interior not doing what we would like to have out of interiors nowadays. That's where the C7 and especially the C8 really shine. The interior quality is much improved over the C6, but at the cost of weight. Because the C6 was so light, one of the biggest reasons for that was the use of plastics on the interior. With the C7, they used more leather, more aluminum, and it did increase the weight to some degree. But with that said, this car is still not terrible. Like, I know it's coming across a certain way, but the interior, even though it is more plasticky, it is still not horrible. And when you drive one, you're gonna immediately realize what it is I'm saying, because the interior is plasticky, but the car just keeps your attention out on the road more than anything, so it evens out. But the name of the game with the Z06, of course, is that big 7-liter V8. It doesn't disappoint. And this, again, is in stock form. So with some aftermarket, this thing would really shine. So my final thoughts of the C6 Z06 are that this is a really cool car. At no point while driving it do I feel like I'm in an 11-year-old car, minus the fact that there's no backup camera, which is kind of infuriating, but we can fix that. So basically what I'm getting at is this is a really great car, and like I said in my previous video, it's one of the best bangs for your buck in my opinion. But let's jump from the C6 over to the C7 and see if, number one, if I feel the difference, which I already know I will, but number two, if the camera guy John feels the difference, because he's never actually ridden in my ZR1 or the C7 in general, and I want to see how obvious the difference is. So let's jump into that car and talk about what the generation divide actually brings us. All right, so here we are inside of the C7 ZR1. Like I said, most of what you'll see and you'll feel in here is going to be the same as you would in the C7 Z06 as well. So even though it is a ZR1, we're going to treat this as a Z06. But let's go ahead and start it up, cold start, and see what the difference in the exhaust sound is. So you can definitely tell it's louder. Again, might be the difference between what the EPA was allowing and what we were doing as a automotive industry. But basically, it's definitely louder. And the first thing you notice when sitting in this car is that it sits, you feel like you sit a lot higher. So you don't climb down into it as much as you did with the C6. The seats are a little bit higher up than they are in the C6. So you feel like the car is sitting higher, when in reality the car is about the same height, just the seat height is different. Still very interesting though. Another thing you notice right off the bat is the infotainment system, the technology, all of the stuff in here that is really just going to be something that you're interacting with every time you get in the car. The dashboard, the carbon fiber, leather wrapped, aluminum everywhere. It is definitely a higher quality interior. Even the second you open the door, like I said, the doors just have a more secure notch every time it goes to that next open position. It's weird stuff like that that just all adds up to what feels like a more quality product. We're basically not even out of the parking lot yet, and I can already feel the frame on this car is much stiffer. Going over bumps and things like that, you're going to feel the car flex much less than it did with the C6. And again, this is with a removable targa top. The power comes on differently because the engine is supercharged, just like it would be in the C7 Z06. Overall, the car feels much more planted to the road. Because of that stiffer frame, it doesn't feel like it wants to flex as much over turns or over bumps. It feels more like a daily driver, I should say. Whereas the C6 maybe is more geared towards the weekend warrior or the track warrior. This is something that could be much easier to live with on a daily basis. Even going around turns feels tighter in the turn, but at the same time more comfortable, because you do get a lot of the creature comforts in this car. You have the option for cooled seats. You have the option for, you know, your infotainment, GPS built in, all that stuff. It is something that is easier to live with daily, and it feels less punishing. Now with this particular car, this is the Ztk package, meaning it is the track package car. If this was the Z06, this would probably be the equivalent to the Z07 package Z06, which would of course have the carbon ceramic rotors, a slightly stiffer suspension, and the Sport Cup 2 tires. But otherwise, same size wheels, basically the identical interior, same gearbox, and pretty much the same engine minus about 100 horsepower. While the ZR1 is a car of its own, it's not that much different than the C7 Z06. And with that said, personally, I feel like the C7 is the easier to drive, more comfortable to live with car because of the creature comforts and because of even just the way it handles the bumps and corners. The ZR1 has a little bit more power than the Z06, but the C7 Z06 is still pretty fast. It's a really lightning quick car, and it has the same handling aspects that the ZR1 does. And again, I can't comment enough on the interior quality here. This is where you spend all of your time when you're driving. The interior of the C7 is definitely improved. The handling aspects, everything seems to be improved at least by 1 or 2 on a scale of 1 to 10. Again, it's up to you as to whether or not that difference matters to you based on the price difference, because you will pay more obviously for a C7 Z06 than you would a C6 Z06. Just this little bit of driving, what have you noticed, John?
That in turns, it is so well planted, it makes sense to me why, from what I know, it does well in the Nürburgring. I can tell night and day difference going into a turn and actually going through a turn. As far as the creakiness, there's none of that. It's more quiet on the road. Obviously, you hear the exhaust being louder, and And the interior, I think, they nailed the interior, I'd say.
Yeah, so that's the real big thing for me, is that from my C5 to the C6, the difference in interior creakiness was improved tenfold. From the C6 to the C7, again, tenfold. From the C7 to the C8, not as much. So you can tell GM has definitely improved their interior game enough with the C7 that there wasn't as much headroom to change to this, for their change to the C8, because the difference in creakiness or just overall flex was nowhere near as greatly improved as it was from the C5 to the C6, or even the C6 to the C7. Now, in today's video, we are focusing just on the C6 and the C7 because I gave away my C5 last year, so I don't have that one to show you. The same difference from the C6 to the C7 applied from the C5 to the C6 as well. John is in the car in the C7 for the first time today, and actually the C6 too, right? So he experienced both of them for the first time today, and that was kind of his first thoughts on what he experienced just being in the car for the last 10 minutes or so. Now, with all that said, guys, we're going to head back to the parking lot. We're going to wrap this video up with our final thoughts. I will catch you guys there. All right, guys, so we are back from our drive, and you can see the car sitting behind me. We have a little bit more data to play with here now. What it ultimately comes down to for me is the C6 and the C7 feel like they are a generation apart. They really do, especially when you drive them. When you look at them, maybe not so much. Like I said in the beginning there, these cars could be as small as 1 year apart. It's really weird when you look at it that way because they feel very different. The C7 is much more composed, planted, and quality feeling. Well, the C6 feels much more raw, ready to go, but you feel everything in the interior is not really up to par. So it really depends on what you're looking for, because price, there's a big difference. You're gonna pay for that extra quality. You're gonna pay for that extra plantedness feeling. You're gonna pay for all this stuff. So the typical price of a C6 Z06 is gonna be somewhere between $45,000 and $50,000. The C7 Z06, more like $78,000 to $85,000 right now. So depending on when you're watching this video, those prices might be a little bit lower, but either way, you're looking at between $20,000 and $30,000 more for the C7 versus the C6, and that's up to you as to whether or not it's worth that difference in price. Even the guy behind the camera agrees this is the better riding car. It is the higher quality feeling car. Is that worth an extra 20 or 30 grand to you? That's up to you at the end of the day. Hopefully this video was helpful, because having access to two separate generations of Corvette is really something that most people don't have in their lives. So I thought I would give you guys my feelings and my impressions based on the fact that I do have both of these cars. If I helped you, please leave me a thumbs up down below. And if you have any questions about this stuff that we did here today, leave those in the comment section as well. I will get back to you, I promise. And of course, I will catch you guys in the next upload.